It was morning, yet the silence of the house felt heavy on my chest. I was sitting on a chair in the kitchen, both hands wrapped around a cup, as if I were holding on not just to warm tea, but to my remaining strength. Living in this house was not my decision, yet leaving it did not feel easy either. Age has slowed my body, but my memories still run fast. I often wonder at which point my life stopped moving forward. And then I realize it didn't stop. My voice simply became softer. Ever since my son continued living here after his marriage, my world has been shrinking day by day. Once I was the queen of this house. Everything moved according to my will. Meals, cleanliness, traditions, celebrations. Now, in someone else's eyes, I am just a burden. An old woman who sits around and does nothing. My daughter-in-law sees only a slow, useless woman. She does not see the pain in my knees, the stiffness in my back, or the sleepless nights that make each morning harder than the last. That day was no different. I was sitting quietly when her sharp voice cut through the air. "You just sit there all day. Why don't you get up and do something for once?" Her words hurt, but her tone hurt more. It felt as though I was not a guest in this house. Not even family. Just an old piece of furniture that could be thrown out whenever it became too inconvenient. I said nothing. My silence made her think she had won. It wasn't the first time. Every day brought a new remark, a new insult. Sometimes the food was wrong. Sometimes the water too hot. Sometimes my walking too slow. Always complaints. My son was often nearby, but either lost in his phone or saying, "Mom, just ignore it." As if wounds to the heart could simply be ignored. I often drift back to my younger days, the days when I woke up before sunrise, washed clothes, prepared lunches, and spent the entire day running this household. No one ever asked if I was tired, but back then I didn't complain. It was my home, my children, my responsibility. I believed that was what life was meant to be. I am still the same woman today, only my strength has faded. When my daughter-in-law shouted at me that morning, something inside me cracked. Perhaps it was my patience, stitched together over years of quiet endurance. I stayed silent, but my mind filled with questions. Was this what I had worked my whole life for? Is this what motherhood leads to, begging for dignity in old age? I looked at her. Her eyes were full of anger, haste, and maybe a trace of restlessness. Perhaps she didn't even know who she was really fighting, me or her own life. I took a deep breath. I wanted to scream, to tell her that I am human too, that I feel pain too. But screaming was never my way. I had always chosen silence as my shield. In that moment, I understood something clearly. My silence was not just my weakness, it was my strength. I reminded myself that not every answer needs a raised voice. Sometimes calm stillness can shake someone more deeply than shouting ever could. She spoke again, but I simply placed my cup on the table and sat up straight. Slowly, her voice faded, as if she herself began to feel the weight of her words. I didn't know what would come next. I only knew this. I was no longer the woman who would bend at every harsh word. Years of silence had not broken me. They had given me depth. And in that house on that quiet morning, a new chapter of my life had begun, without shouting, without tears, simply with my presence. That afternoon, the house felt unusually restless. The walls, once familiar and comforting, now seemed to echo every unspoken word. I stayed in my room longer than usual, not because I was afraid to step out, but because I needed time, to think, to breathe, to gather myself. Silence has a way of making truths louder, and mine were screaming inside my chest. I replayed the morning again and again in my mind. Her sharp words, my calm stillness, the look on her face when I didn't respond the way she expected. For the first time in years, I had not apologized for existing. That realization both frightened and strengthened me. As I slowly made my way to the living room, I could hear voices. My daughter-in-law was talking to my son. Her tone had changed, less aggressive, more defensive. I didn't hear every word, but I heard enough. She complained that I was becoming too quiet, that I was acting strange, that I was making things uncomfortable in the house. I smiled sadly. Funny how silence unsettles those who are used to control. My son looked tired. I could see it in his slouched shoulders and unfocused eyes. He was trapped between his wife and his aging mother, unsure of how to keep peace without taking responsibility. When he saw me, he forced a smile and asked if I needed anything. His question was polite but distant, like one asks a neighbor, not a parent. I told him I was fine, and I meant it. Later that evening, my daughter-in-law approached me again. This time, her voice was lower. but the sharpness was still there. She handed me a list. Chores she wanted done the next day. Washing, cutting vegetables, reorganizing cabinets, tasks that once defined my life, now handed to me like orders. I looked at the paper quietly. My hands trembled, not from weakness, but from emotion. She mistook my pause for hesitation and added, "You're always saying you raised a family. This shouldn't be too hard." That sentence pierced deeper than any shout ever could. I raised my eyes to meet hers. For years, I had avoided that. I had looked at the floor, the wall, anywhere but her face. This time, I held her gaze, calmly, firmly, without anger. "I did raise a family," I said softly, "and I spent my whole life working. But today my body doesn't move the way it used to. Respect should not depend on how much labor I can still give." The room went still. She hadn't expected that. My son hadn't either. There was no shouting, no drama, just truth laid bare. My voice didn't shake. My words didn't rush. I spoke slowly, deliberately, like someone who had waited years to finally be heard. I told them about my pain, my aching joints, my sleepless nights, the way simple tasks now cost me hours of recovery. I told them how loneliness hurts more than physical pain, how being spoken to like a servant breaks something inside that never fully heals. My daughter-in-law crossed her arms, clearly uncomfortable. My son looked down at the floor. Neither interrupted me. That was new. "I don't need luxury," I continued. "I don't need praise. I only need dignity. If that is too much to ask in this house, then perhaps this house is no longer my home." The words surprised even me. I hadn't planned them. They came from somewhere deep, years of swallowed pain finally finding air. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. I wasn't sure what would happen next. Would things change? Would they grow worse? But for the first time in a long while, I felt lighter. Speaking my truth had not destroyed me. It had freed me. The next morning was quieter. My daughter-in-law avoided my eyes. My son made tea for me before leaving for work. A small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Nothing was magically fixed, but something had shifted. The balance had changed. I realized then that silence is powerful, but only when chosen, not forced. For years, my silence had been used against me. Now it belonged to me again. I didn't know how the story would end, but I knew one thing for certain. I would never again allow my worth to be measured by how loudly someone else could shout at me. I didn't sleep that night. After the argument, after the silence that followed my words, I lay on my narrow bed listening to the house breathe. The ticking clock in the hallway sounded louder than ever, each second reminding me how much of my life I had spent swallowing my voice to keep peace. For years, I believed silence was strength. That night, I realized silence was only strength when it was chosen, not forced. In the morning, I woke up before anyone else, as I always did. But this time, I didn't rush to the kitchen. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my hands. These hands had raised children, washed clothes until knuckles cracked, cooked meals no one thanked me for, and cleaned corners no one noticed. I whispered to myself, I am not invisible. Saying it out loud felt strange, almost rebellious. When I finally walked into the kitchen, my daughter-in-law was already there. She looked surprised, maybe even uneasy. She expected the usual version of me, the quiet one who moved quickly, apologized often, and accepted whatever tone she was given. Instead, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat down at the table. She cleared her throat. "Breakfast?" she asked, not kindly, not cruelly, just uncertain. "I'll make my own," I said calmly. My voice didn't shake. That alone felt like a victory. Later that day, my son came home early. He sensed the tension immediately. He asked what was wrong, and before his wife could speak, I did. Not loudly, not angrily, just honestly. I told him how I was spoken to, how small I had been made to feel, how years of my life had turned into unpaid labor because it was easier for everyone else that way. He looked stunned. Maybe he had truly never noticed, or maybe he had chosen not to. Either way, I saw something shift in his eyes, a discomfort that meant truth had finally reached him. That evening, I made a decision I had been delaying for years. I told them I would be moving out. The room went quiet. My daughter-in-law laughed at first, thinking it was a joke. My son asked where I would go. I told him I had already spoken to an old friend, someone who remembered me not as a burden but as a person. I had savings. I had options. I had a life beyond this house. For the first time, they didn't argue. They didn't shout. They didn't command. They listened. Packing my things felt emotional, but not sad in the way I expected. Each folded sweater, each old photograph felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. When I left that house, I didn't slam the door. I closed it gently, the way I closed chapters I no longer needed. My new place was small, quiet. Sunlight poured in through a single window, and for the first time in years, no one told me when to wake up, what to cook, or how to stand. I learned to enjoy my own company again. I spoke to neighbors. I laughed more. I slept better. Weeks later, my son visited alone. He apologized. Truly apologized. Not with excuses, not with conditions. He said he hadn't realized how much I had carried. I told him forgiveness was possible, but only if respect came with it. He nodded. That was enough. As for my daughter-in-law, our relationship changed. Not magically, not overnight, but boundaries have a way of teaching people how to behave. I was no longer the woman she could order around. I was someone who had chosen herself. Now, when I look back on the moment she screamed at me to get up and do something, I don't feel anger. I feel gratitude, because that moment forced me to speak. And when I finally did, my voice didn't just leave her speechless. It brought me back to life. I am old, yes, but I am not weak, and I am done shrinking so others can stand taller.